Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. Merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com.
The first document I found was the Aetna slave policy. The Aetna slave policy. The Aetna slave policy. As soon as the story broke in the media, they backed down on the restitution.
The descendants continue to suffer collective sort of problems. They suffer from extraordinary problems in healthcare, in education, in housing, in every facet of life, infant mortality, life expectancy, in all the areas that speak to the quality of life, the descendants continue to suffer.
And what drives you?
Justice. I'd like to see that the truth is told, and that these corporations that committed horrendous acts against my ancestors pay restitution. They should not be able to keep assets they acquired stealing people and stealing labor.
If our ancestors, and they did, created that wealth, then it seems to me, in a very logical way, that the descendants should benefit from that wealth. Because that wealth having been passed down from generation to generation, companies, foundations, individual families in this nation, it seems to me that those who was directly responsible for creating it, since they did not benefit, notwithstanding the fact that they invested their labor and their lives and all the torture and dehumanizing process that went with slavery, then surely their descendants should, just as the descendants of the wealth on the plantation owner and slave owners, their descendants are still enjoying the wealth. And many companies that came out of the slave period, their economic foundation was based, and stability was based on slave labor, and the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves, and the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves, and the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves, and the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves.
Reparations is the moral equivalent of what we're doing. But reparations is, as you know, a resurgent idea on the left. It's suddenly popular. At least one presidential candidate, but two, I think, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, are now calling for reparations. Is that good or bad?
It's the most ridiculous proposal that I ever heard. First of all, it's important to deconstruct it a little bit. Reparations, you know, the question is, who pays and who gets paid? People don't realize that slavery, there were blacks who owned slaves as well. There were 3,700 blacks that owned 12,000 slaves. Now, 3 tribes, the Chickasaws tribes, the Creek Indians, They own 3,500 slaves. So the question for me and for the audience should be, well, who pays? Do the sons and daughters of those blacks and Native Americans that own slaves, do their ancestors, do they pay? And so it's a little more complicated than people are making. What about the whites who came here after slavery? What about the hundreds of thousands who died fighting again in the Civil War who never owned slaves?
Right.
And so I just think that we ought to take this into consideration when we're talking about slavery. It's also providing exemption from personal responsibility. With all of the problems that Black America has, for someone to say that the answers to those challenges are external. Let's just say we accept the premise that reparations should be paid. What problem does it solve? If whites paid blacks money on Monday and we come back 2 weeks later, what would be the impact on black crime? What would be the impact of drug addiction, about the high dropout rate? And so I just think it's lethal for us to just talk about a simplistic remedy so we can do virtue signaling on the issue of race and appear to be champions. What we have done at the Woodson Center is we believe you should look into the Black America's past and find out how our ancestors achieved against the odds where there was racial inequality and income disparity. We built hospitals, we built schools, we had solid families. And so it is important for us to not to look back, but also to look at what are our strengths. And frankly, Tucker, I'm going to say I think Black America needs to abandon complaining about what happened in the past and begin to address the enemy within. That's the challenge we face today. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our liberators. Right. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our liberators. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our
Continuing where I left off from the first segment, this is where we shed some light amongst the darker areas of America's history and pinpoint the mistakes that were made that are in desperate need of correction. Mind you, in order to fix a problem, you must first begin at the very root of a problem. Otherwise, you are skipping vital information that could lead us into positive changes in the near future. This is why it is very essential to know the truth about your past, because if you allow a stranger to tell you all about your past without any valuable sources of creditable documentation, you will inadvertently misrepresent yourself and, more importantly, misrepresent everything that your direct ancestors died for. So, who are these people that should be held responsible for the millions of broken promises, compulsory educational institutions, unpaid laborers and unpaid military soldiers who fought and died for the uprising of this country, destroyed legacies, cultures, and spiritualities, inequality in workplaces, generational poverty, stolen land allotments, racism, concentration camps turned project housing reserved for only a large median of colored people, identity theft and paper genocide, and many years of injustice and discrimination? The most important persons of value towards this floating debt system would be the victims of sharecropping, the Negro farmers. Agriculture was big business throughout North America, even before the Civil War, and history fails to mention that it was the Negro farmers who were wronged by everyone else involved in the trade of resources and goods. People of today's society of America tends to believe that slavery in America was about some pale-faced foreigner living on a farm or plantation in which he allegedly owned many slaves, And numerous people would suppose that all of those slaves were so-called black people being held in bondage. No, during that time period of the South, the majority of farms were actually owned by people of color, and many of the palefaces known around town were slaving, or rather conducting laborer duties as promised, being as though they were squatters on those farms, which meant that their occupations were to assist the landowners with producing crops and maintaining the farm's livestock, etc. These squatters were later referred to as tenant farmers. This process is known as the system of sharecropping. According to the Webster's Dictionary, sharecropping is defined as a tenant farmer, especially in the southern U.S., who is provided with credit for seed, tools, living quarters, and food, who works the land, and who receives an agreed share of the value of the crop minus charges. End quote. In other words, there was a particular trade relationship between the Negro farmers and the tenant farmers that were now squatting on their lands. And thanks to the likes of public laws, like the Preemption Act of 1841, for example, the Negro farmers were unaware that their lands could now be purchased and claimed by the tenant farmers after just 14 months of residence. The Preemption Act of 1841 granted settlers the right to occupy the Negro farmers' lands legally, but fraudulently, and the government, along with many other co-conspirators, even without permission from Negro farmers, changed these lands to read as public lands due to the establishment of the land banks and the farm credit system, in which I'll get into this shortly. As I've mentioned in my previous segment of this topic, slave contracts, or rather indentures of servitude, were created by banks and business owners, and they were sold with floating debt, or rather credit. But how do you take Negro farmers and then turn them into a slave? Well, you introduce them to the idealism of currency. Today, currency is defined as a system of money in general use in a particular country. The word currency derives from the Latin word currere, which means to run. It is a flow of energy which runs and circulates from person to person. This is why trading was introduced. The term trade is a Middle Dutch word from the late 14th century, meaning track or course. And in order to produce currency through trade, one would use their own energy to run that same track or course. This formal practice was conducted amongst most tribes and or nations of people for quite a while. And in order to make a slave, you would first have to slightly alter the process of the said trade system that was initially utilized by adding in a form of currency. An environment for economic behavior was induced upon the trade process, which allowed for the devaluation of the products that were being exchanged. And with this change came a decreasing need for having a great amount of Negro farmers, because any individual could buy from a Negro farmer and sell whatever it is back to the consumers at a higher rate, causing that individual to put whatever price tag they want on that same flow of energy that someone else provided. It's essential to note that this task was very difficult to manifest during much earlier time periods of history across these lands, due to the common use of gold and silver and other things of value that provided a medium of exchange. Originally, there was a bartering system, which allowed for the trade of goods and services in return for other goods and services, but not necessarily being of equal value. And when it comes to the Negro farmers, whatever was needed would have to be purchased directly from the Negro farmer at the farmer's price, due to the pale-faced squatters' lack of knowing how to farm. But with the creation of a credit system and a paper currency, a person could then purchase from the Negro farmer with floating debt, which is credit, and then sell those same crops grown by the Negro farmers to another person at whatever price they choose. This was the birth of what is known as the open market. Any person that takes advantage of this utilitarian method could now also control consumption or depletion, which segues into supply and demand. Note that this was not a quick process of just taking someone's word for a product, crop, or piece of paper. Other forms of currency were set into place first, like silver, gold, and coins, etc., to make purchases and conduct trade for crops and land, because it was seemingly smarter and more convenient to carry a note that somehow held the same value as weight in gold, opposed to actually carrying around a large bag of gold. Shortly thereafter, instead of holding onto large surpluses of crops for trade, people began to do business under promises, literally, deciding to trade in their valuable commodities for promissory notes, making this the biggest mistake ever made in US history without any exaggeration. Multiple promissory notes were circulating during this time period, but they were known around town as greenbacks, then officially became known later on as legal tender notes. This is what began the circulation of a paper currency here in the US. In the year 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, which not only allowed for the finance of the Civil War, but it was also used to ripen the climate for the National Currency Act of 1863, which allowed for the creation of a national banking system. And then there was the National Bank Act of 1864, which required the banks to purchase government bonds, or rather indentures of servitude, which were literally oral or written contracts that stated that labor will be redeemed for these same legal tender notes. And although it is true that the Civil War required a substantial amount of money and credit for the manpower used, most importantly, someone needed for those wars to happen so that those monetary acts could take place. The creation of legal tender notes opened the doors wide to a monopoly and allowed for a small group of people to now have full control of the trade. This small group of people were known as bankers that eventually controlled everything from crops, land, products, and even the trade of people and the government. A legal tender note was the US form of paper money from the years of 1862 to 1971, and many of these legal tender notes were backed by gold, and some of them weren't. That is why someone or some bodies thought it was necessary to replace them with Federal Reserve notes. Starting in the year of 1933, the government made it illegal to own or hoard a certain amount of gold, which was of course more valuable than their legal tender notes across the world. And with Executive Order 6102 becoming law, all gold was called out of circulation, and anyone with gold was ordered to turn it into the Federal Reserve banks. Any persons not adhering to this order by law was subject to hefty fines or imprisonment, or both. Why was this so important to the government? Simply because of the difference between a legal tender note and a Federal Reserve note. One note represents a bill of credit for something received, which was a representation of the government's indebtedness towards the holder, and the other note represents a fiat currency, which is not backed by any physical commodity of silver or gold, making the government non-liable for its use or misrepresentation. This Federal Reserve note has been the main form of currency since the Executive Order 6102 was given in 1933. And it is also important to note that this presidential order stems from the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which gave the president power to oversee and restrict any and all trades between the United States and its so-called enemies in times of war. All of this falls back on the establishment of the credit and debit system and how the creation of credit scores affected the buying rights of people of color, still to this very day. So, This allowed the government to continue with printing paper money that was not backed by an equal amount of silver or gold. But wait a minute. If paper money is not backed by any previous commodity or any physical security, then what is it backed by? Nothing other than human capital. I'm just here to make you think.